Alrighty, so I know what you're thinking. You've clicked on this video and you're like, yeah, I want to learn critical thinking, but I don't want to do so unless an incredibly attractive dude explains it to me. Well, as you can see, you're in luck. So I wanted to make this video for those of you who want to learn a bit about critical thinking. You want to learn what it is, why it's useful, some of the tools that you would learn in a critical thinking unit. But I also wanted to make it because there's shockingly little videos on this topic if you're studying in Australia. So if you're studying a Bachelor of Arts degree in Australia, critical thinking is generally a mandatory unit. Depending on what major you choose, it may be different. I'm going to touch on that in a second. But I also wanted to just say that you can absolutely still get a lot out of this video if you aren't studying in Australia, because I assume that critical thinking is a mandatory unit for other countries too if you're studying a Bachelor of Arts degree. And you can also enjoy this video if you just want to learn a bit about critical thinking. Alright, so diving straight in, I've got a PowerPoint presentation here, as you can see, and this first slide here, this is a screenshot of two different universities and the majors that you would study in a Bachelor of Arts degree. The top list here, the ones in blue, is a list of the majors at a Bachelor of Arts degree if you're studying at Monash University in Australia. And the bottom list is a list of the majors if you're studying at Macquarie University in Australia. So I did this just to show that critical thinking may not be a mandatory unit. The top list here, the ones at Monash, critical thinking is only in certain majors. So philosophy, politics, journalism, history, like a lot of these will have critical thinking as part of that major, but it won't be a part of the Bachelor of Arts degree as a whole. But this bottom list here, the one for Macquarie University, no matter what major you pick here, critical thinking is a part of the Bachelor of Arts degree as a whole. It's a mandatory unit. And so I just wanted to point out, you might want to check the university you're studying at. Again, if you're in another country, just definitely check this too. But critical thinking is great to have under your belt no matter what you're studying, really. Even if you're studying science or you're studying, engineering. Like, I feel like critical thinking is great in day-to-day life. So regardless of what you study, you'll hopefully get something out of this video. All right, so what is critical thinking? Well, critical thinking is learning how to reason well. And that's pretty much it. So we use reasoning when we're forming beliefs, when we're making decisions, presenting arguments and evaluating arguments made by others, which naturally spurs the question, well, what are arguments? Arguments are reasons given to support a belief or claim. So that probably sounds very different to how we usually hear the word. When you hear arguments, most people think it means like fighting, like verbal fighting, a verbal dispute. And that's not really how the word argument is used in academia. In a critical thinking unit, arguments are something different entirely, but I'll touch on that in a second. I just wanted to say something about key topics in critical thinking. So here we go. Understanding the structure of arguments is going to be a key topic in critical thinking. Formulating your own arguments, critiquing and identifying common errors in reasoning, standardizing informal arguments, common principles and common fallacies, and logic. So don't worry if you don't know what some of these words mean, like standardizing or fallacies. I'll touch on that in a second, but I just wanted to say I'm not going to touch too much on logic in this video. Logic almost deserves its own video, and I might actually do so. It's essentially the backbone of critical thinking, but it's not the be-all end-all of critical thinking. But it's a big topic, and so I didn't want to... This video will already be pretty long without touching on logic, and I feel like logic would make it twice as long. So I'll do that in a separate video, but just know that it is a part of critical thinking. Alrighty, so what are arguments? So arguments are reasons for accepting or rejecting a claim. So a good way to tell if something is an argument is if you're reading something, for example, ask yourself if the passage is trying to convince you of a claim by providing reasons for believing it. If so, it's an argument. So I've got here a little example. Either Bob or Susie stole the cookie. Susie didn't steal the cookie. Therefore, Bob stole the cookie. That's an argument. It's trying to convince you that Bob stole the cookie, and it's also providing reasons for accepting that claim. So you'll also learn when you take critical thinking that arguments are generally formulated in a structure of premises and a conclusion. So the conclusion is the point you are arguing for, and the premises support the conclusion. So here we go. I've got it written a bit more formally. I've essentially standardized it, but I'll touch on standardization in a second too. So here we go. Premise 1. Either Bob or Susie stole the cookie. Premise 2, Susie didn't steal the cookie. Conclusion, Bob stole the cookie. So there we go. That's an argument. It is laid out in premises and conclusion form, and you can absolutely see how the premises support the conclusion. It gives you a reason to accept the conclusion. So what is standardization? So standardization is taking an informal argument and representing it formally. So even though I probably could have used the previous example, I wanted to include another one just to sort of get the point across a bit more. So here we go. Walter doesn't like the taste of coffee, and he's trying to give up caffeine, so he won't want a coffee. So we can standardize this as premise 1, Walter doesn't like the taste of coffee. Premise 2, Walter is trying to give up caffeine. And conclusion, Walter won't want a coffee. So that's standardization. I've taken what was written in the example part there and I've formalized it. I've put premises and a conclusion. And yeah, that's standardization for you. So I wanted to just add this in, implicit premises. It's not too important, but it kind of is if you're going to be standardizing arguments. Like maybe in class you're asked to standardize some arguments in a book that you're reading or something like that. You'll want to know about implicit premises. Essentially, arguments sometimes will have premises that aren't explicitly stated, and that is an implicit premise. So it's a premise that isn't said in the actual argument, like in the book maybe that you're reading, but it's assumed by the author. And so if you were to standardize an argument, you would include an implicit premise. So when you're representing an argument from an author, only include implicit premises that are important to the argument. I learnt this in my course and it's actually pretty important. So because you don't want to include like implicit premises that you don't think the author would be assuming, because you don't want to put words in their mouth essentially. But I've written here, ultimately, it's a matter of judgment, and it really is. There's no rule book for this sort of thing. You sort of have to just, I mean, the unit, like studying critical thinking will help you get really good at it. You'll be better with it, but it's not you'll never be perfect at it. You just got to do the best that you can. All right, so common principles. You learn this too. And so I've written here, when representing someone's argument, there are a few principles you should follow. Now, technically, you don't have to adhere to these principles, but generally you want to be as honest as possible, because being honest in debate or when representing someone's argument, it shows that you genuinely care about having an honest dialogue. I remember thinking when I learnt these sorts of things, like, wow, I feel like politicians just take this unit and are like, I'll do the opposite of all of these principles, because they don't adhere to these principles at all. But generally, we want to be more honest. So that's why some of these principles are really important. So I've got here 3 principles that you should adhere to when representing someone's argument. So the principle of fidelity. So ask yourself, am I being faithful to the intent of the argument? Is my representation accurate? Have I included enough information? And are the claims I'm including as premises and conclusions one the arguer actually made or implied? So there we go. That's the principle of fidelity. The principle of charity. So, have I presented the original argument in its best light? Have I inadvertently made it weaker in my standardization than it really is? Or have I inadvertently made it stronger? Because remember, it's not your job to fix an argument. If an argument is bad, just let it stand or fall on its own merit. But we generally want to be as charitable as possible without, doing more work than we need to be doing when standardizing an argument. And the principle of temperance. So, have I been balanced in the amount of detail I have included? Have I overdone it with making the implicit explicit? Could I have left some of this out without affecting the argument? That's essentially the principle of temperance. So, if you know nothing about any of this stuff going in, you also probably heard the word fallacies and were like, well, what is that? A fallacy is essentially a reasoning error. So that definition doesn't really explain it too well. So I've included here some examples of fallacies that are very common you'll see in like debate or argument. So I've written here the ad hominem, the straw person fallacy, the burden of proof, the bandwagon fallacy, and the slippery slope. And there are many more informal fallacies. I've included here a website that you might want to check out. It's got a list of like a lot of common fallacies. It gives you like a description of them and then provides an example so you can understand them more. But I'll just touch on a couple of these just so that you understand what a fallacy is. So a bandwagon fallacy is essentially if someone makes an argument, say they say that, this thing is true, and when you ask why it's true, they say, well, because everyone believes it's true. That's an example of a bandwagon fallacy, because the amount of people that believe something doesn't affect the truth of the matter. And a good example is if we were around 3,000 years ago, the majority of people believed that the Earth was flat. But that's not the case, and it didn't matter how many people believed it. It doesn't change the truth of the matter. Sorry, flat earthers, you're just going to have to deal with that. Another example of a fallacy is the burden of proof fallacy. So someone shifting the burden of proof is considered fallacious, because if you make a claim, say that you say unicorns exist, and I ask, why do you believe that? And you say, well, can you disprove it? That's shifting the burden of proof, and it should be pretty obvious why it's a fallacy. It's not your job to disprove a claim. If someone makes a claim, they have to back it up. It's their job to prove it. So don't let anyone shift the burden of proof onto you. That would be a fallacy. And an ad hominem fallacy is essentially attacking the person rather than the argument. So if someone makes an argument, let's say it doesn't really matter what argument, let's just say they present an argument and the person that's debating them replies, yeah, well, you did this and this in your personal life, so we shouldn't really be listening to you. That's a fallacy, because it doesn't matter what the person did. Like, who presents an argument doesn't matter who they are. What matters is whether the argument is valid or not. And it doesn't change because of who the person is. So you can almost, I like to think of it as, say that someone says 2 + 2 = 4. That's true, no matter who says it. If Adolf Hitler says it, it doesn't matter. It's still true. Like, no matter how bad the person is, the argument it stands or falls on its own merit. And so if someone attacks the person rather than the argument, they're committing the ad hominem fallacy. So there we go. I've given some examples of what fallacies are. Hopefully you get a bit more of an overview now of what they are. I'd still encourage you to check out the link that I provided. It'll go into a lot more detail and hopefully make you understand what fallacies are a bit better. But yeah, this is just a general overview, so I won't touch too more on this. All right, coming to the end of the video now. So when to apply these tools. So if you're studying a Bachelor of Arts degree, there are a lot of majors where this is very useful, and also just a lot of things in day-to-day life where this is useful. So if you're studying philosophy, journalism, history, politics, science, and literature, there's some fields of study where critical thinking tools are very useful. But I mean, learning how to reason well is helpful in day-to-day life too. Like, you can absolutely test some of these tools out if you want to check out like news articles, social media, and books. You can apply some of the tools that I went through today and test them out for yourself. Like maybe check out a debate or something like that. Type in debate on YouTube or something and see if you notice them committing any fallacies, or see if you notice any of them violating some of the principles, like maybe they're not being charitable enough. See if you can even like standardize an argument that someone makes informally into its formal premises and conclusion form. I hope this video helped. Please let me know if it did. And yeah, if you want to watch more, feel free to like and subscribe. You totally can. Only if I've earned it though. And yeah, I will probably make another video soon on logic, because I feel like that needs a video too on what you'd be learning if you are studying logic in Australia, and again, probably other countries. But anyway, thank you very much for watching and have a good one.